My name is Margaret Whitmore, and I am 72 years old. For most of my life, people have described me as a strong woman. I raised 3 children after my husband died. I worked as a school principal for 27 years. I paid for their education, helped them buy their first cars, and even supported them when life became difficult. I believed family meant loyalty. I believed that the love you give your children comes back to you one day. But the day my own children sat across the table and calmly discussed putting me in a nursing home was the day I realized something was very wrong. Before we continue, if you enjoy powerful life stories like this one, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and join this growing community. And I would really love to know where you are watching from today, so write your city or country in the comment section. I always read the comments, and it makes this story feel like we are sharing it. It all began on a quiet Sunday afternoon in my living room. My daughter Rebecca called and said we needed to have a family discussion. That already felt strange. My children rarely arranged meetings unless something serious was happening. When they arrived, I noticed something unusual immediately. Daniel, my eldest son, was carrying a folder. Rebecca looked serious, almost rehearsed, and Kevin, my youngest, barely made eye contact with me. I made tea for everyone like I always did, but the room felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. After a few minutes of uncomfortable silence, Rebecca cleared her throat. "Mom," she said gently, "we're worried about you." I smiled and asked why. She exchanged a glance with Daniel before answering. "You've been forgetting things lately." That statement surprised me. Yes, sometimes I misplaced my glasses or forgot where I left my keys, but I was 72, not helpless. Daniel then opened the folder and slid a few papers across the table toward me. "We think it might be time for you to consider professional care," he said calmly. "A place where people can help you daily." I stared at the documents. The words at the top felt like they were written in bold letters meant to shock me. Nursing home evaluation recommendation. For a moment, I thought this must be some strange joke. I looked up at them, expecting someone to laugh. No one did. Kevin finally spoke, but his voice sounded hesitant. "Mom, it's just for your safety." Safety. That word echoed in my mind. I had lived in the same house for 38 years. I managed my finances, drove my car, and cooked my own meals every day. What danger were they talking about? I asked them directly, "Do you really believe I can't take care of myself?" Rebecca quickly leaned forward and placed her hand over mine. Her voice sounded sweet, but something about it felt unnatural. "Mom, we just want what's best for you." But as she spoke, I noticed something else. Daniel was watching my reaction carefully, almost like he was studying me. And Kevin still refused to meet my eyes. That was the moment a small feeling of doubt entered my mind. I had spent my life reading people. As a school principal, you learn how to notice when someone is hiding the truth. And at that table, something felt rehearsed. Something felt planned. Daniel then explained that they had already visited a place called Silver Pines Care Center. He described it as peaceful and comfortable, with medical staff available all day. Rebecca added that many families move their parents there when they reach a certain age. I listened quietly. They spoke as if the decision had already been made. As if my opinion was simply a small formality. Finally, Daniel said the words that changed everything. "Mom, we've already scheduled an evaluation for you next week." For a few seconds, the room became completely silent. I looked at each of my children slowly. The 3 people I had sacrificed everything for were now calmly arranging to move me out of my own life. I could have shouted. I could have argued. But instead, I did something that surprised them. I smiled. Rebecca seemed relieved when she saw that smile. Daniel leaned back in his chair like a man who believed the hardest part of a conversation was over. But inside my mind, a different thought was forming. You see, I may be 72 years old, but I am not a fool. When people start making decisions about your life without your permission, it usually means something else is happening behind the scenes. And as I looked at my children sitting around that table, I began to ask myself a question that would soon change everything. Why were they in such a hurry to move me out of my own home? That evening, after they left, I sat alone in my living room and stared at the walls that had witnessed my entire life. Family photos covered the shelves. My late husband's favorite chair still stood near the window. I should have felt fear or sadness, but instead I felt something else rising inside me. Determination. Because if there was one thing my children had forgotten, it was this. They were not the only ones capable of making plans. What they didn't know that night was that before they ever placed me inside a nursing home, I had already started watching them very carefully. And soon, I would discover exactly why they were so eager to send their own mother away. But what they didn't realize was that their plan had already made a very big mistake. And that mistake was underestimating me. If this story already surprised you, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, because what I discovered after entering that nursing home would shock even me. And before we continue the story in the next chapter, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I'm always amazed to see how many different countries follow these stories. And trust me, what happened next inside that nursing home was something my children never expected. The day my children drove me to Silver Pines Care Center was the day I truly understood that something in my life had quietly shifted. My daughter Rebecca held my arm as we walked through the front doors, smiling at the nurses as if she were doing a noble thing. Daniel stood beside the receptionist, filling out paperwork, and Kevin carried my small suitcase. Anyone watching us would have thought I was a fragile old woman being lovingly cared for by responsible children. But deep inside, I felt something very different. I felt like I had just stepped into a place where I was not meant to stay. The building itself looked peaceful. The walls were painted warm colors, and soft music played somewhere in the hallway. A nurse greeted us kindly and showed us to my room. Rebecca kept repeating the same sentence again and again. "Mom, this is only temporary until we know you're safe." Temporary. That word sounded comforting, but something about the way she said it felt rehearsed. When the nurse left the room, Daniel sat down beside my bed and spoke in a calm voice that almost sounded professional. "Mom, the doctors here will evaluate you. It's just routine. Once they confirm everything is fine, we'll discuss the next steps." I noticed something very interesting about that sentence. He didn't say I would go home. He said they would discuss the next steps. That was the first sign that their plan might already be moving further than they wanted me to realize. After they finished arranging my things, they stood near the door like visitors preparing to leave a hotel room. Rebecca hugged me quickly. Kevin gave me an awkward smile. Daniel told me to rest and cooperate with the staff. Then they walked out together. I sat quietly on the bed and listened to their footsteps fade down the hallway. For the first time in my life, I felt like a guest in my own story. But I wasn't scared. I was observing. Over the next few days, I watched everything carefully. The nurses were kind, especially one named Elena. She treated me with respect and often asked if I needed anything. But what interested me more was not the nursing home itself. It was the sudden behavior of my children. They began visiting often, but their conversations always turned toward the same topics. My finances. My house. My documents. One afternoon, Rebecca sat beside me and casually asked, "Mom, do you remember where you kept the property papers?" I looked at her slowly and pretended to think for a moment before answering. "Oh dear, my memory isn't what it used to be," I said softly. She nodded with a small smile, but I could see a flash of frustration in her eyes. 2 days later, Daniel visited alone. He spoke politely, but his questions felt like an interview. "Mom, do you still manage your bank accounts yourself?" he asked. I shrugged gently and said, "Sometimes I forget things." That answer seemed to satisfy him more than it should have. That was when the truth began to reveal itself. They were not visiting to comfort me. They were testing me, watching me, measuring how confused they could make me appear. One evening, something happened that confirmed my suspicion completely. I was sitting near the hallway window reading a book when I heard Daniel's voice from around the corner. He was speaking on the phone and didn't realize I was close enough to hear him. His voice sounded quiet but confident. "Yes, the process is moving forward," he said. "Once the evaluation confirms she can't manage her affairs, We can move ahead with the property. Property. That single word felt like a cold wind passing through my chest. My house was not just property. It was the place where my children grew up. The place where their father's memory still lived. Yet Daniel spoke about it as if it were already something to sell. I stayed perfectly still until his conversation ended. That night, I sat in my room and thought carefully about everything I had seen and heard. The nursing home. The sudden concern about my memory. The questions about my documents. The phone call about my property. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, and that picture was not kind. My children were not trying to protect me. They were trying to control what belonged to me. But there was something they did not know. Before I had ever stepped inside Silver Pines Care Center, I had already made one quiet decision. A decision that would soon change everything. Earlier that week, during my very first evening here, I asked the receptionist to help me make a phone call. The number I dialed belonged to someone who had known me for many years. My lawyer, Jonathan Hale. When he answered, I told him something very simple. Jonathan, I said calmly, I believe my children are planning something, and I need you to help me find out what it is. There was a long pause on the phone before he replied. Margaret, I had a feeling this day might come, he said quietly. And in that moment, the real story had finally begun. If you are still listening to this chapter, I want to pause for a second and thank you. Stories like this remind us how complicated family can be. And I'm always curious to know where people are watching from, so take a moment and write your city or country in the comments below. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel around the world. Because in the next chapter, what my lawyer discovered about my children would reveal a plan far bigger than I had imagined. And the people who believed they had quietly placed their mother in a nursing home were about to learn that their mother had quietly started an investigation of her own. The moment I called my lawyer, Jonathan Hale, the story that my children believed they were controlling began to change direction. You see, my children thought I was confused, weak, and easy to manipulate, but they forgot one important thing about me. Before I became a mother, before I became a grandmother, before I grew old, I was a woman who spent decades leading a school, solving problems, and reading people. I knew how to stay calm when something felt wrong. And right now, everything felt wrong. Jonathan Hale had been my lawyer for almost 15 years. He helped me handle my late husband's estate and manage several legal documents over the years. When he heard my voice on the phone that evening, he immediately noticed something serious in my tone. Margaret, he said carefully, tell me exactly what is happening. So I told him everything. I explained the sudden family meeting, the nursing home evaluation, the strange questions about my finances, and the phone call I overheard Daniel making about my property. Jonathan listened quietly without interrupting. When I finished, he was silent for a few seconds before speaking again. Margaret, he finally said, what you're describing could be an attempt to gain legal control over your assets. That sentence confirmed the suspicion that had been growing in my mind since the day my children sat around my living room table. But Jonathan was not a man who rushed to conclusions. Instead, he suggested something that surprised me. For now, he said, do nothing. Let them believe their plan is working. At first I didn't understand what he meant, but then he explained his strategy. If my children were truly trying to declare me mentally unfit, they would need evidence to support that claim. That meant they would continue visiting, asking questions, and observing my behavior. Jonathan wanted me to do something very specific. He wanted me to pretend. Act forgetful when they visit, he said. Let them believe their story. I almost laughed when he suggested it, because the truth was that I had already started doing exactly that. Over the next several days, my children continued visiting Silver Pines Care Center. Rebecca arrived one afternoon carrying a small notebook. She sat beside my bed with a gentle smile and began asking casual questions. Mom, do you remember the name of your bank? She asked sweetly. I looked up at the ceiling as if I was trying very hard to remember. Oh dear, I sighed softly. I know it's something blue. That answer seemed to please her. She quickly wrote something down in her notebook. 2 days later, Daniel visited again. This time, He brought a man he introduced as a financial advisor. The man asked polite but very direct questions about my accounts, my property, and my will. I answered slowly and vaguely, pretending to struggle with my memory. Inside my mind, however, every detail was being carefully recorded. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hale had quietly started his own investigation. Using his legal access, he began reviewing financial records connected to my accounts. What he discovered shocked even him. Just 2 weeks after the family meeting, someone had attempted to request financial authorization forms from one of my banks. The request was signed using my name, but the handwriting was not mine. Jonathan immediately contacted me again. "Margaret," he said seriously, "someone tried to gain control of your accounts." That news confirmed everything. My children were not simply worried about my health. They were preparing to take control of my money and property. But the situation became even more disturbing when Jonathan continued digging deeper. He discovered that Daniel had recently contacted a real estate agent asking about the market value of my home. Rebecca had also made inquiries about something called a power of attorney. For those who don't know, a power of attorney is a legal document that allows someone to control another person's finances and decisions. If my children managed to prove I was mentally incapable, they could legally gain that control. In other words, they could run my entire life. But here is the part they never expected. Every step they were taking was now being carefully documented by my lawyer. Every phone call, every request, every suspicious action was quietly being recorded as evidence. One afternoon, while I was sitting in the garden area of the nursing home, Nurse Elena approached me gently. She had been watching my children during their visits and noticed something strange about their behavior. "Margaret," she said quietly, "may I ask you something honestly?" I smiled and nodded. She lowered her voice and asked, "Do you actually feel confused like they say you are?" I looked at her for a moment before answering calmly, "Not at all." Elena stared at me with surprise. Then she smiled slightly and said something that gave me even more confidence. "I thought so." That moment reminded me that not everyone believed the story my children were telling. And slowly, the truth was beginning to gather witnesses. But what my children didn't know was that the investigation had already moved to its next stage. Because the evidence Jonathan was collecting would soon reach someone whose job was to deal with cases exactly like this. An investigator. And when that happened, the people who believed they were quietly removing their mother from the picture were about to find themselves standing in the center of a very serious investigation. Before we continue to the next chapter, I want to ask you something. Stories like this reach people all over the world, and I'm always amazed when I see where viewers are listening from. So take a moment and write in the comments where you are watching from today. Your city or your country. I love reading them. And make sure you stay for the next chapter, because when the investigation officially began, the truth about my children's plan started coming out faster than they could hide it. And the day justice finally knocked on their door was much closer than they imagined. By the time the 4th week arrived at Silver Pines Care Center, the quiet investigation that my children thought they were controlling had already turned into something far bigger than they could imagine. My lawyer, Jonathan Hale, had spent days collecting records, reviewing documents, and tracing every small move my children had made since the day they decided I was suddenly too confused to live alone. What he discovered was not just suspicious. It was alarming. When Jonathan called me that evening, his voice sounded calmer than usual, but I could hear the seriousness behind his words. "Margaret," he said carefully, "the evidence is starting to show a clear pattern." He explained that Daniel had contacted more than one real estate agent asking about the value of my home. Rebecca had spoken to a legal assistant about preparing power of attorney documents. And Kevin, the quiet one, had tried to access information about one of my retirement accounts. None of these actions was illegal on its own, but when placed together, they told a story that investigators understood very well. A story about people preparing to take control of someone else's assets. Jonathan told me he had decided to take the next step. He had shared the evidence with a financial crimes investigator named Laura Bennett. Now, Detective Bennett was reviewing everything. When I heard that, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and strength. Sadness because the people being investigated were my own children, but strength because the truth was finally moving toward the surface. Meanwhile, my children continued visiting me at the nursing home, completely unaware that every move they had made was now part of an official review. Rebecca visited first that week. She arrived with the same gentle smile she always wore when she was pretending to be concerned. She sat beside my bed and began asking her usual questions. "Mom, have the doctors said anything about your memory tests?" she asked softly. I pretended to think for a moment before answering slowly. "I'm not sure, dear. Everything feels a little blurry these days." She nodded sympathetically, but her eyes quickly moved around the room, almost like she was calculating something. Then she asked another question. "Do you remember if your will was updated recently?" That question confirmed something important for me. They were not only thinking about my present. They were planning my future. Or at least the future they believed they would control. 2 days later, Daniel arrived. This time, he seemed unusually confident. He pulled a chair closer to my bed and spoke in a calm voice that sounded almost rehearsed. "Mom, the evaluation is going well," he said. "The doctors are noticing your memory issues." I looked at him with a confused expression and asked quietly, "Is that bad?" Daniel sighed and shook his head gently. "No, Mom. It just means we may need to manage your finances for you." There it was. The sentence that revealed everything. Manage your finances for you. He spoke those words as if they were a small favor he was offering me, but I knew exactly what they meant. And at that moment, I realized just how confident they had become in their plan. What Daniel didn't know was that at the same time he was sitting beside my bed pretending to protect me, Detective Laura Bennett was reviewing the evidence file Jonathan had sent her. She had already discovered the bank authorization request with my forged signature. She had seen the messages Daniel sent to real estate agents about selling my house quickly. She had also read Rebecca's inquiry about obtaining power of attorney if a parent was declared mentally incompetent. When investigators see those pieces together, they don't ignore them. They start asking questions. And that is exactly what Detective Bennett began doing. That Friday afternoon, something unusual happened at Silver Pines. I was sitting in the garden area enjoying the quiet sunlight when Nurse Elena approached me with a small smile. "Margaret," she said softly, "you have a visitor." I expected to see one of my children walking through the hallway. Instead, a tall woman wearing a professional jacket stepped into the garden. Her eyes scanned the area calmly before she approached my table. "Mrs. Whitmore?" she asked politely. I nodded. She introduced herself in a steady voice. "My name is Laura Bennett." The name immediately caught my attention. Jonathan had mentioned her during our last phone call. Detective Bennett sat down across from me and spoke quietly so that no one else nearby could hear us. "Your lawyer shared some information with me," she explained. "I'm here to ask you a few questions." For the next 20 minutes, we spoke calmly about everything that had happened since the day my children arranged the family meeting. I described their questions about my accounts, their sudden interest in my property, and the phone call I overheard Daniel making in the hallway weeks earlier. Detective Bennett listened carefully, occasionally writing notes. When our conversation finished, she looked at me with a respectful expression and said something that stayed in my mind long after she left. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said quietly, "sometimes the people we trust the most underestimate the strength of the person they are trying to control." As she stood and walked away, I realized something important. The quiet investigation that had started with a single phone call to my lawyer had now reached the hands of someone whose job was to uncover the truth. And when that truth finally arrived at my children's doorstep, their carefully planned story was going to collapse in a way they never expected. Before we continue to the next chapter, I want to pause for a moment and thank everyone listening to this story. It amazes me how many different places in the world people follow these stories from. So take a moment and write in the comments where you are watching from today. Your city or your country. I read them all, and it reminds me how far these stories travel. Because in the next chapter, something happened that my children never saw coming. And when justice finally knocked on their door, The people who believed they had quietly placed their mother in a nursing home suddenly realized they were the ones under investigation. The morning everything finally changed began like any other quiet day at Silver Pines Care Center. The sunlight was coming through the tall windows in the hallway, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted from the dining room. To anyone watching, it looked like an ordinary, peaceful place where elderly residents spent calm days resting and talking with nurses. But behind the calm surface, something important was about to happen. For weeks, my children had believed their plan was moving forward perfectly. They thought the doctors would eventually declare that I could no longer manage my life. They believed that once that happened, they would gain control over my house, my finances, and everything I had worked for. What they did not realize was that while they were quietly planning my future, another plan had been quietly forming around them. My lawyer, Jonathan Hale, and Detective Laura Bennett had spent weeks gathering evidence. Every suspicious request, every financial inquiry, every document connected to my name had been carefully examined. The forged bank authorization request had already raised serious questions. The real estate inquiries Daniel made about selling my house had been documented. Rebecca's attempts to learn about the power of attorney had also been recorded. Together, those pieces created a pattern investigators could not ignore. That Friday afternoon, Rebecca and Daniel arrived together to visit me. They walked into my room with the same calm confidence they had shown for weeks. Rebecca sat beside my bed while Daniel stood near the window, looking around the room. "Mom," Rebecca said gently, "we have good news." I looked up slowly with the same confused expression I had been using during their visits. "Good news?" I asked softly. Daniel smiled in a way that made it clear he believed everything was finally falling into place. "The doctors are close to finishing their evaluation," he explained. "Soon we'll be able to take care of things for you so you don't have to worry anymore." Take care of things for you. That phrase again. They spoke about my life as if it were something that could simply be transferred into their hands. Rebecca leaned closer and spoke in a comforting voice. "Mom, we'll make sure everything is handled. The house, the bills, your accounts. You can just relax." I nodded slowly, pretending to struggle with understanding. But inside my mind, I was watching them carefully, because I knew something they didn't know. Just as Rebecca finished speaking, there was a knock on the door. Daniel walked over and opened it. Standing in the hallway were two people he did not expect to see. Detective Laura Bennett and another officer. For a moment, Daniel's confident expression froze. Rebecca turned toward the door, confused by the sudden interruption. Detective Bennett stepped into the room calmly and looked at all of us before speaking. "Mr. Whitmore, Ms. Lawson," she said politely, "we need to speak with you regarding an ongoing investigation." The room became completely silent. Rebecca looked at Daniel with confusion while Daniel tried to maintain his composure. "Investigation?" he asked carefully. Detective Bennett nodded. "Yes. We have reason to believe there have been attempts to gain financial control over Mrs. Whitmore's assets using fraudulent authorization and misleading documentation." Rebecca's face suddenly lost its color. Daniel quickly tried to respond. "There must be some mistake," he said firmly. But Detective Bennett continued speaking with calm authority. "There was also an attempt to request financial authorization from one of Mrs. Whitmore's bank accounts using a signature that does not match her official records." Now neither of them spoke. They stood there staring at the detective. I sat quietly on my bed watching the scene unfold. For the first time since this entire situation began, the balance of power in the room had completely changed. The people who believed they were controlling the story were now being asked questions about their own actions. Detective Bennett continued explaining that the investigation was still ongoing and that several documents and communications were now under review. She did not accuse them directly in that moment, but her message was clear. The situation they thought they were controlling had turned into something far more serious. Rebecca finally turned toward me with wide eyes. For the first time since this began, she looked unsure. "Mom, did you know about this?" she asked quietly. I looked at her calmly and answered with the same gentle voice I had used for weeks. "I may be 72 years old, Rebecca," I said slowly, but I am not helpless. Neither of them said another word. After the officers finished speaking with them, they left the room looking very different from the confident visitors who had walked in earlier. When the door closed behind them, I felt a deep sense of calm. Not victory, not revenge, but something simpler. Truth. In the weeks that followed, the investigation continued, and my lawyer helped me reorganize my legal documents to protect everything I had worked for during my life. I eventually left Silver Pines Care Center and returned to the home where my family history lived in every corner. The place my children once believed they could quietly take from me. And as I sat again in my living room one evening, I realized something important. Age does not erase wisdom. Experience does not disappear with time. Sometimes the people who underestimate you are the very ones who reveal their own intentions. My children believed they were removing me from the picture, but instead, they exposed a plan that would have remained hidden if they had treated their mother with honesty and respect. If you have listened to this story until the end, I want to thank you for staying with me through every chapter. Stories like this travel far beyond one home or one family. People from many different places listen and share their thoughts. So before you go, tell me something in the comments. Where are you watching from today? Your city, your country, anywhere in the world. I read every comment, and it always reminds me that even a single story can connect people across the world. And remember this one simple truth from my story: never underestimate a mother who has spent a lifetime learning how people really behave.